Peter Lawford made the introduction. He was always making introductions. Peter, charming, effortlessly connected. The kind of man who moves through rooms as though born into all of them simultaneously. His wife was a Kennedy sister, which placed him adjacent to power without ever quite holding it himself, which perhaps explains why he spent so much of his life as a conduit, a go-between, a man who opened doors for other people and watched them walk through. The dinner was in early 1954. The setting was a private home in Bel Air, the kind of gathering that never appeared in any social column, where the guest list was selected for its combination of glamour and discretion, and where the unspoken rule was that what happened there stayed there. Marilyn Monroe had been asked to come. John Kennedy, then a senator from Massachusetts, had expressed a desire to meet her. This is how it worked in that world. Desire was expressed. The machinery moved. People appeared. She wore a red dress. Several people who were there have mentioned the red dress, separately, independently, in the way that specific details survive when the overall memory has reason to be guarded. She was 27 years old, already the most famous woman in America, already carrying the full impossible weight of what the world had decided she was. He was 36, already being talked about in certain rooms as a future president, already possessed of that particular quality, the quality of someone moving towards something inevitable that makes people want to be near him. What happened that evening is not fully documented. What can be reconstructed from the accounts of people who were present, from letters and phone records and the careful, pieced-together record that researchers have assembled over decades, is that they were seated near each other, that they talked for a long time, and that whatever passed between them in that conversation was enough to begin something that would last, in one form or another, for the remaining 8 years of both their lives. She called him Jack. He called her Marilyn, which was not what people who knew her well called her. People who knew her called her Norma, or sometimes just MM, the initials that had become their own shorthand, but he was not, in the beginning, someone who knew her. He was someone who wanted her, in the way that powerful men want things. Completely, and with the assumption that wanting is the same as having. He was wrong about that. This surprises people, somehow, as though the narrative of Marilyn Monroe as a passive recipient of other people's intentions has become so fixed that evidence to the contrary seems improbable. But the record, read carefully, tells a different story. She was not passive. She was not simply available. She made choices. She entered this thing with her eyes open, or as open as eyes can be when the person you're entering it with is the most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world, and has surrounded himself with an apparatus specifically designed to make everything around him seem inevitable. She had been watching the Kennedys before the dinner. She had been paying attention to politics in a way that surprised people who had decided she couldn't. She subscribed to newspapers. She had opinions about the civil rights movement, about poverty, about the direction of the country that were more developed and more genuinely held than most people who met her expected. When Arthur Miller, then her husband, took her into certain political and intellectual circles, she had not simply stood there looking beautiful. She had listened, asked questions, formed views. The world had not noticed, because the world was too busy looking at her face. She noticed Jack Kennedy, the senator, before she met Jack Kennedy, the man. She noticed his politics, his positioning, the careful construction of his public self. When she met him she was, therefore, not meeting a stranger. She was meeting someone she had already assessed and found interesting. The finding interesting was real. The mutual attraction was real. The disaster that would follow from it was also real, but it was not visible yet. In 1954, in the red dress, in the early evening light of a Bel Air house where someone had decided these two people should meet. They met again. And again. The meetings were never simple, never clean, always wrapped in the logistics of concealment that defined everything in Jack Kennedy's personal life. He was married. He had been married to Jacqueline Bouvier since 1953, a marriage that was itself a complex negotiation, a public performance, a partnership that both parties understood at some level to be a kind of arrangement, one of many arrangements that held the structure of John Kennedy's life together. Jacqueline Kennedy was not naive. She was not a victim, exactly. She was a woman who had made a particular bargain and was living with the terms of it, with the grace and the iron that the bargain required. None of which made what was happening between her husband and Marilyn Monroe simple. The relationship developed over years, not continuously, not exclusively, punctuated by long absences and other entanglements on both sides, but persistent in the way that connections between certain people are persistent, returning even when both parties have ostensibly moved on. Marilyn Monroe's marriage to Arthur Miller ran from 1956 to 1961. During parts of that marriage, she and Kennedy were not in contact. During other parts, they were. The overlap is uncomfortable and was kept carefully invisible during their lifetimes. People who knew her say she cared about him. This is the uncomfortable truth that gets lost in the versions of this story that reduce her to a symbol. She was not simply dazzled. She was not simply using the access for advancement. She cared about him as a person, which meant she was vulnerable in the way that people who care about someone are always vulnerable. She saw things in him that she found genuinely admirable: his intelligence, his curiosity, what she believed was a real commitment to making the country better. She also saw, with the perceptiveness she had developed over a lifetime of reading people for survival, things that were less admirable. The carelessness, the entitlement, the fundamental inability of powerful men of that generation to regard women, even women they desired and respected in limited ways, as fully real. She talked about him to trusted friends. She talked about him to Dr. Greenson. She wrote about him, though what she wrote has largely been lost or suppressed. The picture that emerges from these fragments is of a woman who understood perfectly well the nature of what she was involved in and chose to be involved in it anyway, because the alternative, not caring, keeping herself safe by staying behind glass, was something she had been trying to do her whole life and had never quite managed. She cared. She always cared too much for her own safety. This is who she was. Robert Kennedy entered the picture later, and the nature of his involvement with Marilyn Monroe is murkier, more disputed, and in certain ways more significant to the story of her death than John Kennedy's. Bobby, as everyone called him, was a different kind of man from his brother. Less charming, more intense, possessed of a moral seriousness that made him both more admirable and more frightening than Jack in certain respects. He was the Attorney General of the United States. He was genuinely committed to civil rights, to fighting organized crime, to the idea of justice as something more than a political convenience. He was also, like his brother, a Kennedy, which meant the rules he applied to himself were not the same as the rules he applied to others. The relationship between Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe is the one that the Kennedy family has most strenuously denied. It is also the one that, based on the available evidence, appears to have been the most emotionally significant from her perspective. People who knew her in 1961 and 1962 describe a shift in how she talked about the Kennedys. Less focus on Jack, more on Bobby. A different quality to the mention of his name. Something that sounded, to people who knew her well enough to hear it, more serious than what had come before. They were introduced through Peter Lawford again, at a party in Los Angeles in the fall of 1961. Bobby Kennedy was there without his wife Ethel. Marilyn Monroe was there between marriages, newly divorced from Miller, somewhat adrift, in the complicated period between one version of her life and whatever came next. The party was, again, the kind that left no public record. The introductions were made. People talked. What they talked about surprised people who learned of it later. Bobby Kennedy was not simply making small talk with a beautiful movie star. He was genuinely interested in what she thought, about politics, about civil rights, about the future of the country. And she had things to say. Informed, considered, genuinely held things to say about all of these subjects. He was surprised by her, in the way that everyone was always surprised when Marilyn Monroe turned out to have a mind, as though the possession of a mind and the possession of that face were mutually exclusive, as though beauty that comprehensive left no room for thought. She found him interesting. She found his seriousness interesting, after years of men who were primarily interested in her as an object or a symbol or a conquest. He seemed to see her, or she believed he seemed to see her, which for someone who had spent her entire life being watched without being seen amounted to the same thing. Whatever developed between them, and it developed, that much is not seriously disputed, it was not simply an affair in the Kennedy brothers' accustomed mode. There are accounts, from people who heard her speak of it in that period, that suggest she believed it was more. That he had said things, made suggestions, given impressions of a future that was not what he intended. That she had heard in his words a promise that he would deny ever making. This is the version of events that is most painful and most plausible. Not a conspiracy, not a cold calculation, but something more human and therefore more terrible. A powerful man who found her fascinating and told her so, who let her believe the fascination was something more permanent than it was, who then found himself with a problem. A woman who was not going to disappear quietly, a woman who was not going to accept the standard management of the situation, and who dealt with that problem in the ways available to men of his position, which were considerable. The phone calls began to go unanswered. The messages were not returned. The access she had believed was personal turned out to be managed. She discovered at some point in the spring of 1962 that calls she believed were going to Bobby Kennedy were being intercepted, that she was being handled by intermediaries while the appearance of contact was maintained. This discovery, that she had been managed rather than known, was, by all accounts, deeply wounding to her. She was not simply upset about a love affair going wrong. She was confronting the pattern of her entire life. The experience of believing herself seen, of allowing herself to be vulnerable, of reaching for connection that turned out to be conditional, that turned out to be available only when it was convenient for the other person and revocable the moment it became inconvenient. She had lived this pattern since childhood. She had married it twice. She had built her entire public existence around the hope that fame would make her immune to it. And here it was again, in a new form, wearing a different face, but the same thing underneath. It was around this time that the red notebook, the diary of facts rather than feelings, the record she was beginning to assemble of things she had heard and seen and been present for in rooms where she was not expected to be paying attention, began to take on a different character. It had started as something more personal, more emotional, a way of processing. It became something more deliberate, something more pointed. She had been in rooms where things were said. She had heard conversations about Cuba, about covert operations, about things being done in the name of the United States government that the United States public would never be told about. She had heard these things because she was in those rooms, and the people in those rooms had not fully believed she was listening, or had not fully believed that a listening Marilyn Monroe was anything they needed to worry about. They were wrong. She was always listening. She had been listening since she was a child, since it had been her only protection. The gathering of information, the understanding of the room, the careful reading of every person in it that allowed her to navigate environments that were frequently hostile. She had listened her way through foster homes and orphanages and Hollywood and 3 marriages. She had listened in these rooms, and now she was writing it down. Whether she intended, from the beginning, to use it, to make it public, to take it to the press conference that was being planned for August 6th, or whether that intention solidified only gradually, over the spring and summer of 1962, as the phone calls went unanswered and the management became more obvious and the anger and hurt of a woman who had been managed once too often finally reached a kind of terminal point. That is harder to know. What is known is that by the summer of 1962 certain people were worried about her. Not about her welfare, not in any meaningful sense. Worried about what she knew and what she might do with it. Worried about the gap between what she had been allowed to hear, in the assumption that she was a beautiful irrelevance, and what she was apparently now considering doing with what she had heard. The surveillance was real. Her phones were tapped, she knew this, had been told by people she trusted who knew about such things. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had a file on her. This is documented. The file contained information about her associations, her relationships, her private conversations. Hoover collected such files with the enthusiasm of a man who understood that information was power and who spent his career accumulating as much power as could possibly be accumulated. The Monroe file was substantial. What was in it exactly has never been fully revealed. Portions have been released under Freedom of Information requests over the years, but they are heavily redacted. Black bars obscuring names, dates, operational details. What can be read between the black bars, in the fragments that remain visible, is the outline of a woman being watched much more carefully than a simple movie star's tragic decline would warrant. She was not simply a woman having a breakdown. She was a woman who knew things, who was angry, who had decided she was done being manageable. She was a woman who had found her voice, not the performance voice, not the breathy, carefully constructed voice that the cameras loved, but her actual voice, the one that had always been there underneath, that had been there since Norma Jean Mortensen was 9 years old, washing dishes for $10 a week and paying very careful attention to everything around her. She was going to use that voice. She had arranged to do so. August 6, 1962. She died 2 days before. The world has been told that the Kennedy connection is a romantic story with a sad ending, the inevitable tragedy of a beautiful woman who loved unwisely. The romantic story is real. The sad ending is real. But between the romance and the ending is something more complicated, more troubling, more important than the romantic narrative allows for. Marilyn Monroe was not destroyed by love. She was not simply a woman broken by heartbreak and pills and the pressure of fame. She was a woman who had accumulated, over the last years of her life, information and anger and determination in approximately equal measure, and she was destroyed. If destroyed she was, if this was not the suicide the official record calls it, at the precise moment she was about to do something with all three. The love story with the Kennedy brothers is real. What it obscures, what it has always been used to obscure, is the other story. The story of a woman who was not simply desired but feared, not simply mourned but silenced, not simply lost but stopped. Jack Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, 14 months after Marilyn Monroe died. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June of 1968. The decade destroyed them all. The questions about what they knew, what they did, what connections lay between these deaths, those questions have never been satisfactorily answered, and perhaps never will be. What we can say, looking at all three lives and all three deaths, is that they existed in a world where knowing too much and saying so was genuinely dangerous. That they all, in different ways, crossed lines that someone had decided should not be crossed. That the personal stories and the political stories were, in that world, in those years, inseparably tangled. And that Marilyn Monroe, who loved unwisely and lost much and kept watching and kept listening and finally, at 36, decided she was going to say what she knew, she was part of that story. Not just the sad, beautiful appendage to it. Not just the symbol. A participant, with knowledge and intention and 2 days left to live. The red dress is in a museum now. The letters, the ones that survived, are in archives. The phone records are gone. The red notebook has not been found. And somewhere, in the gap between what we know and what we are allowed to know, the real story of Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedy brothers is still waiting to be fully told. It is a love story. It is also something else entirely. And the something else is why, 60 years later, it still matters. She is owed that much. The world that watched her so completely for so many years, that consumed everything she offered and then consumed the story of her death with the same appetite, owes her at minimum the full story. Not the managed version. Not the version that keeps the powerful people comfortable. The version that includes all of it, the love and the anger and the knowledge and the plan and the 2 days she didn't have. The love story is real. But the woman in the love story was not only a woman in love. She was a woman with a mind and a history and a red leather notebook and a press conference scheduled for a morning she never saw. That is the story we are still learning to tell. That is the story that, if we are brave enough to keep asking the questions, may yet be fully told. She deserves nothing less. Peter Lawford died in 1984. He was estranged from the Kennedy family long before then, cut off in ways he never fully explained publicly. In his final years he gave fragments of interviews in which he hinted at things he knew, things he had seen, things that had happened in and around the night of August 4th that he had never spoken about completely. He never completed the story. He died before he could, or before he chose to, and those who believe the distinction matters find it significant that the story remains incomplete. The red dress that Marilyn Monroe wore the night she met John Kennedy at the party in Bel Air, no one knows exactly what happened to it. The famous dress, the one she wore to sing Happy Birthday Mr. President at Madison Square Garden in May of 1962, sold at auction for millions of dollars. It is preserved in a museum. But the red dress, the first one, the dress she wore to the dinner where everything started, that dress is part of the unofficial archive, the things that mattered which the world did not think to preserve because it did not yet know they would matter. Everything about this story has that quality. The things that mattered most were not preserved, or were deliberately unmade. The phone records, the notebook, the letters, the full files. We are left with fragments, outlines, the shapes that objects leave behind when they have been removed. And yet the shape of her is still there. Unmistakable. Larger than what the world decided she was allowed to be. Reaching, as she always reached, for something more complete than what she was given. We are still reaching back. That is the least we can do.